What is intergenerational trauma? Intergenerational trauma is the trauma that is experienced by each person and then passed down to their children, who pass it down to their children, who pass it down to their children. So I thought it might be really helpful for me to identify my own intergenerational trauma. And I know that this makes me vulnerable and open, and it's almost like airing dirty laundry per se. But I feel really strongly that I have a purpose in this world, to help other people to heal from their own trauma. I have come so far since my own trauma that I experienced, which I'll mention, when I go through my pattern. And I've come so far, and I need to show other people how to do it. I need to show women, men, children how to identify their trauma and heal from their trauma, because it is possible. I am proof that there is life after trauma. And so my own intergenerational trauma, so as far back as I know on my mum's side, is my grandparents, so just my nan and pop. My nan had 11 children, and one of them passed away while my mum was growing up. It was the time of, not having enough money. My mum mentioned not too long ago that she recalls, my nana like ticking up, getting credit for some, food at the local corner store. And so I know how hard financial stress is. I've lived with it a lot, being, a young mum and a single mum. I completely understand the anxiety and stress that financial hardship causes. And then my pop passed away when my mum was young. So my nana was a single mum of, 11 and then 10 children, losing one. And that's trauma. There is trauma in losing a partner. There's trauma in losing a father. My mum grew up in that trauma. And then as my mum grew up and then had children, we experienced, and I don't want to say trauma from mum's side, but there was trauma that we experienced, and I guess it's all just a pattern. On my dad's side, I know that my great-grandfather was in the war. I can't even imagine, what he experienced there. Well, not that I can't imagine, I don't want to imagine what he experienced there. And my understanding is that he was a very heavy drinker. So, his children, his son, who was my grandfather, was an alcoholic. And then his wife passed away. My understanding is that I think my dad found his mum deceased in the home, and that caused a huge trauma for, my grandfather and then my father. And so then my father is an alcoholic, and, he worked a lot and he tried his best to provide for the family. But there is a trauma for me around his excessive alcohol and use, and, what I witnessed and experienced and, was impacted by through his excessive alcohol consumption. So I grew up with trauma in experiencing childhood sexual abuse, which was outside the family. I was a family friend. And then I became quite rebellious as a teenager. Well, the term is rebellious. Really, I just didn't feel like I belonged anywhere. I didn't feel that I fit in. I didn't connect. I was so overcome with emotions to do with disclosing the sexual abuse, making police statements, attending court, understanding what had actually happened to me. I was so overcome with, depression, anxiety, hypervigilance, that I you know, I was one of those teenagers. I caused my parents hell. I put them through hell. And I was just trying to come to terms with my own trauma. So I've forgiven myself for, for the what I put my body through, my mind through, what I put my parents through. I've had to forgive myself for that because it was how I felt at the time, and they're the only tools that I had. I didn't have any tools that I have now, like meditation, mindfulness, picking up my absolutely favorite spiritual teachers like Abraham Hicks and Dr. Joe Dispenza. I didn't have those tools back then that I do now. So that was the way that I dealt with my trauma. I know that my sisters have their own trauma for various reasons, to do with, alcoholism and childhood sexual abuse, which was outside of the family. I believe that my healing is, absolutely attributed to the work that I've done in the last, 10 years. And there are shortcuts. There are shortcuts to healing, by using different modalities. I practice hypnosis, and I do see people for that to reframe and to flatten trauma, or the emotions associated with the memories of trauma. But that's intergenerational trauma. My children then, after what I experienced growing up, I then had my own children, and I have a dog behind me. My own children experienced significant domestic violence, and they grew up with a mum who was still trying to heal from her own trauma, or even understand what the trauma was that I experienced. You have to be able to name that and identify the trauma before you can heal from the trauma. And they grew up with a mum who was traumatized and just trying to do her best. And they had a father who perpetrated significant domestic violence, not just in our relationship, but in a subsequent relationship. And then he was incarcerated for that domestic violence abuse that he perpetrated towards his next partner. And they had a father that, was in jail. And they had parents who were dealing with their own, mental health. I know that their father he didn't grow up with his biological mum. That created a huge trauma of abandonment. So while when you don't start to identify what you've been through and what that means for you, and what, how that's coming out in your life, you have to be able to name it and identify it in order to start to reframe it. And so if you don't identify that, you have mental illness, for me, or mental health for me, is when you've experienced trauma, or you are currently experiencing trauma, your body and your mind's job is to keep you alive. It is to protect you. Your mind will do anything and everything that it needs to do to protect you. So one of the very first things it does is it signals the body. Body instantly and automatically goes into survival mode. So survival mode means you will either fight, flight, or freeze. And that's how you'll be protected, because you either fight off the threat, you run from the threat, you freeze or hide from the threat. What happens is after the threat has passed, our bodies will go back to normal. So back to baseline, back to homeostasis, it's called. The problem is that we live, Dr. Joe Dispenza states that the average person spends 70% of their day living in survival mode. So when your body goes into survival mode, it's drawing energy from everything that's not absolutely essential to either fight, run, or hide. So during survival mode, your immune system doesn't have the extra, energy and stuff that it needs to just do what it does. So your body draws from your immune system, your elimination system, your your breathing changes, your hearing changes, your vision changes, everything heightens to look for that threat, to beat the threat, to overcome the threat. So while your body is in survival mode, it is not healing on a cellular level. Your body cannot replenish cells, it cannot regenerate, it cannot heal wounds, it cannot flush through your immune system, digestive system, everything that is not essential to surviving in that very brief time or short period of time is moved to the only job that the mind has to do, which is to keep you alive. So if we are living 70% of our days in that state, it means that more often than not, we're not healing. Our bodies aren't working properly. Your elimination system, your digestive system, oxygen, nothing's working the way that it's supposed to. When you go into survival mode, your heart rate increases. That's not good for your heart if it's going like this for the better part of 70% of your day. And so once you realize that you have to get out of survival mode, you have to understand what it is, you have to learn how to get out of it, or you're just not going to heal. When your mind is on threats all the time and in that survival mode, directing the body into survival mode, it's not safe. And until your mind feels safe, you won't heal anything internally either. You won't. And so the point of that slight tangent was that the trauma responses that we have, that we respond as, our reactions and responses in order to keep us safe there's safety and protective measures that we've learnt. And so if the threat only comes around, once a week, your body will go into survival mode. You will either, run, fight, hide, freeze, all the rest of it until the threat is gone. Body goes back to normal. When the body's constantly up here and it doesn't get a chance to be safe, it can't come back down to home. It can't get back to homeostasis. It can when it's safe, but the problem is that everything we perceive, threats in the way the tone of voice somebody uses, because it might immediately project us back to feeling, rejected as a kid. A lot of our stuff comes from childhood. That's just what the research is. That's what it's proven to be. So when you're enacting these responses, it's because you're detecting that there's a threat right here, right now, because you've been projected back to how the experience you had in childhood. And that's probably, I could go a little bit more in depth in another video. But yeah, so the whole point of this is that we have to identify our trauma, we have to understand our trauma, and we have to be able to heal from our trauma, because intergenerational trauma is the passing down of the trauma from parent to child, parent to child, parent to child. And we know enough that we can learn to break these cycles. We can learn to heal. I have been learning to heal for the better part of 10 years, and it's probably in the last 12 months that I've really, really, really figured it out. I've figured it out, and I'm still learning how to put that into practice, but I've figured out how to get there, and that makes life a whole heap easier. So this is what my page is about, my videos, my writings. I am going to be raw, honest, vulnerable. I'm calling this, everything for what it is. We need to heal our trauma. And Only until we heal our trauma will we experience, true freedom and bliss and happiness. And isn't that what we all want? I know that's what I want. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.